Welcome to the Water Boys. It becomes clear the more you know, you realize you don't know much. This universe is quite complex from the human perception. Everything from big to small has its connections somehow. We just may not see it. We are ants in an ant farm, trying to understand things way beyond the barriers of the farm we live inside. We can apply this to the idea of God. What is God? It seems like forever man has fought, killed, sacrificed, debated, constructed, and done about everything towards a god or gods. Is there a common thread that runs through all ancient stories, cultures, structures, rituals, or even gods? I'm asking that you open your mind, please. Take this moment to just be open-minded to the possibility that something bigger could be going on throughout history. A wise Buddhist saying, "If one desires to know the truth, then one holds no opinions." I believe this is true of everyone. We are all on this journey together. Now here are a few quotes from some famous mathematicians in history. Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe, Galileo. The uniform character of mathematics is the essence of science, for mathematics is the foundation of all exact scientific knowledge, David Hilbert. Geometry is one and eternal shining in the mind of God. That men share in it is among the reasons that man is the image of God, Johannes Kepler. Mathematics is the language in which the gods speak of people or to people. The knowledge of which geometry aims is the knowledge of the eternal, Plato. Actually, everything that can be known has a number, for it is impossible to grasp anything with the mind or to recognize it without this. Philolus, is that right? Philolus. I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. There may be babblers wholly ignorant of mathematics who dare to condemn my hypothesis upon the authority of some part of the Bible twisted to suit their purpose. I value them not and scorn their unfounded judgment. Nicholas Copernicus. A wise man speaks because he has something to say. A fool because he has something to say. Quoted in the Des Macal Wisdom. If you are listening to this program via Audibly, I want to go ahead and give you a heads up, then you will be missing the visual aids. That's okay. You'll still be able to keep up. But if you want the full essence this program offers, check our YouTube program out, The Water Boys. Subscribe and like this video. There's going to be a lot more of this to come. Now, turning this over to the magnificent Dr. Luther G. Williams. Doctor.
Derek, I think the information we have is utterly magnificent, and it'll help us all to discover our inner magnificence, if you can say that. You know, it's sometimes hard, I guess, for us to think about a world without the internet. We've had it forever, it seems like. But even back in those days, our special guest that we have on the show today was an avid fan of documentaries on television and radio. His name is Alan. And every chance that this young man would get, he would exercise his passion for gaining information and organizing it. He's always had a keen interest in history, especially hidden or lost history, as well as mythology and religion. Now, Alan first worked in the field of construction manufacturing, and he might have stayed there, but in 2010, he was diagnosed with a serious illness that steered him away from the construction business and in the direction he'll be taking us today. It was the series Secrets in Plain Sight by Scott Onstott that inspired Alan to begin his own research into sacred geometry some 6 years ago. And since then, he's been working nonstop, presenting his own research as well as that of others. And he has published on YouTube, Derek, some 800 videos on sacred geometry. That's right, you heard right. 800 videos since 2012, which works out to about 133 videos per year, or one video every 3 days. So he's been busy. So the Water Boys have the pleasure of introducing to you, or if you're already familiar with his work, presenting to you this wonderful man who stopped by with a truckload of information and insights. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome warmly Alan, Sacred Geometry Decoded.
Hello, Lufa, and hello, Derek. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to sharing some insights and hopefully sparking some thoughts, and keen to see your reactions and how it all links up. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, with all you have to offer, that's guaranteed. I tell you, let's start off with a general question that I think is probably on everybody's minds, and that is, how do you define this field of sacred geometry? Because I suspect that a lot of people are more familiar with it than they think, but they may not know it as sacred geometry. So what would be a concise definition of what we're talking about here?
Well, I think that's at the core question and one of the biggest issues, because sacred geometry is a relatively new term, and a short time on the internet with a few searches of sacred geometry, you'll find quite a variation of what it means, how people apply it, and what they think about it. But I think at essence, to know what it is firstly to look at all of them collectively and see if there are certain common threads that are shared by all practitioners, believers, or people interested in sacred geometry, and there are some very clearly defined ones. So the issue in itself, if we could start, would be even the term sacred geometry. The term sacred can be that in itself is a word that's hard to define, and it will also turn some people off, but bring some people in. But it is a very ill-defined term, I think we can begin with geometry and the common threads that people share. So whether it's the Vesica Pisces or the flower of life, you'll see these symbols connected and drawn, and all sorts of animations, and people examining those aspects in more geometric ways. That ancient architecture would be another thread, which would be often shared by people with an interest in what's generally termed sacred geometry. Music will often be connected, and so I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the 4-3-2 versus 4-40 concert pitch tuning, which would be a musical aspect. And well, this will also apply to, let's say, the great cathedrals, for instance, of Europe, which are places such as Chartres Cathedral also seem to be places which are that draw in the researchers of this general area. And I think so, to know exactly what sacred geometry is out of a very broad term, we look at the key or the common threads that join them, and that this would be astronomy, because of the astronomical alignments of whether it's the pyramids or whether it's cathedrals. We see this as a common thread. Music and acoustics, because a cathedral would be a classic example. The building itself would be tuned to have the most inspiring musical effects and to capture the sound, and to, just like a concert hall would be applied the same way. And this is through the use of proportions and measurement, but generally under architecture. And this is part of an ancient tradition which from the great cathedrals, again going back in time, you'll see certain themes repeated in architecture. And so geometry and music, arithmetic and sacred number. So numbers such as 432, 108, these might be numbers that people are familiar with in the Bible, as we've spoken in preparation for this. Numbers such as 144 or 153 are especially pronounced and well known amongst Bible numbers, but this is part of an aspect, again, which goes back in time, cross cultures across the world, and is able to be seen but measured. And that's why I've got this image here, and I think this is one of the keys of exactly what sacred geometry is. I think whatever people, however they apply themselves to it, or whatever they can draw from it in a beneficial way, is great. But the common threads amongst sacred geometry really begins with geometry. The term geometry itself implies a system of measurement. For instance, geo is earth and metry is measure. That's where the origin of the word meter is to measure, and so geometry itself means earth measurement, which would apply to this greater themes of sacred geometry. And so it's weights and measures, whether it's measurements of length, such as the 12-inch foot, the 360-degree compass, pan scales for measuring gold and silver or precious spices, but even just common goods such as grain or wine. But also time is a measurement, and what you'll also find is that temperature is a measurement, and somehow even in amongst these ancient systems we'll find a pattern of number which is going to link weights and measures such as these instruments here, and these instruments themselves are the basis of modern science. So all technology we have now is built around a system of weights, measures and mathematics, and these are the core themes which define ancient civilizations, but we can find the same ancient pattern repeating even in the allegedly modern secular world. And so sacred numbers are still emerging even in the most secular scientific situations.
Now, Alan, just something to touch on here. Our audience may or may not be listening through audio or video, so I kind of clarified in the intro that we would have, they'd be able to track either way. So we may have visual aid here, but everything you explain is pretty easy to hear and understand as well, which I love that about your content. It sounds to me, and to put this in a nutshell, we're talking about earth measurement, which earth measurement isn't just measuring something like what you would think about ground in a modern context, just something like, oh, a tree to a tree. Yeah, that might be part of it, but it's everything that encompasses us on this earth. Everything that is in our existence, if you will, could be part of this measurement system, dealing from man to nature, time, weights, sound, I mean, you name it. And so all of these things, just to put it in a nutshell, we find within the Bible, we find within ancient literature, not just the Bible, and we see a common thread, not only in the ancient world, but in these texts that do not make these texts necessarily exclusive and divisive, like, oh, we've got the answer, you don't, but rather kind of shows a common thread, if I'm not mistaken. And this might be going into an interpretive field, which you're not trying to do, but I'm asking the audience to be open to thinking, what does this mean for our interpretive methods? That's all I'm asking. So I'm going to go ahead and mute and...
Okay, well, so I think we have these common threads that everyone would agree is shared amongst sacred geometry and generally termed sacred numbers, but especially for those people who are even secular, let's say, or materialist, that the importance of this particular system is that it can be measured, it can be tested, and you can see it repeated throughout the past, but we'll also be able to see it actually predicting major new buildings as they're being constructed or major new city plans, so that it's still happening now. But the pattern is, again, something can be measured, counted and tested, and we'll certainly see it in ancient India, in the Mayan culture, in biblical tradition, but also we'll find it in ancient Egypt, also ancient stone circles, and as well as other stone sites such as the Karnak alignments in France as well. And what we have is a very particular pattern, I think, and the repeated elements is music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy, the quadrivium, they being at least those which can be sort of clearly measurable. But I think, but also one of the most powerful arguments for this, as I have this illustration here, so it's basically showing a man with his arms out. Now, this goes back to this ancient Greek well-recorded principle, but we'll see evidence for it in older civilizations. But just to begin with the Greco-Roman period, because we have such clear documentation, textbooks such as Vitruvius's 10 books of architecture, or the works of Heron, which describe all the elements of architecture, but also alchemy and color, and basically it's an engineering textbook, and it's very well. It's written in a way that is clearly understandable to us now. There's evidence, for instance, in hieroglyphs of these types of events, but it's they don't read as a science textbook. They're very poetic. And a lot of people believe that there's actually quite a bit of scientific knowledge hidden in there, but I'd just like to stay with where we have very clear repeated texts, and there are a few, especially Greek and Roman works, whether it's the geometry of Euclid. So that's probably still the world's most popular, widely spread, distributed book is Euclid's Elements, which is the basics of geometry. And this has been in constant publication across all religions that have had access to it for 2,000 years. So it's still a textbook now for geometry. We have the 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius, which is a textbook of the philosophy of architecture, of town planning, but it's also a engineering textbook of how to build machines to move and lift heavy stones on a full book. It's interior design and the weights and measure system. So the image there is a man with his arms out, because the concept is that, and for instance, Greek temples would be designed on the principle of the perfect proportions of an idealized person. And so if you have fingertip to fingertip should be your height. So you have a symmetry that's happening there. But what I have is we have apparently unconnected units of measure coming together. So firstly, that quote by Protagoras, that man is the measure of all things. And this is a concept in geometry. We would look at the geometry of a human, and you could describe it with geometric forms, but everything will connect as well to measurements and proportions, which will lead to larger connections. Now, for instance, the cubit that I'm describing here is actually the ancient Egyptian royal cubit, which was used to define the pyramids. So what we have now is the allegedly modern meter, but we'll find that this is actually quite ancient and connects to ancient units of measurement. So we have a meter, we have an Egyptian royal cubit, and we have 1 foot. So an Egyptian royal cubit plus 1 meter equals exactly 5 feet. Therefore, an English foot plus an ancient Egyptian royal cubit plus 1 meter equals 6 feet. And that in itself will equal 72 inches or 216 grains. And so you might ask, well, what's a grain? An inch is made of 3 barleycorn. That was an ancient definition. So what you'll find is that still now, ceremonially at least, that units such as the inch or ounces are defined by a number of grains, because a wheat grain or a barley grain would be of a similar size and similar weight. So you could make a good approximate, but it was more complicated than that. The king or the local lord would have a set of weights, for instance, and weights would be tested. But as a general rule, you could say that 1 inch was 3 barleycorn, and so many barleycorn added together would be an official ounce. So being a definition of coins.
Did you have something you were trying to say, Luther?
Yeah, Alan, you were talking about all these connections and that man is the measure of all things. It is true, not only in sacred geometry, but also in science. You may be familiar with the work of Nassim Haramein, who's a theoretical physicist. And he published a paper some years back on the Schwarzschild proton. And what he found is that in the measurement of all things, from the very small to the very large, man is right in the middle. Human beings are exactly in the center of things. And that's exactly what man was considered in the medieval world, the measure of everything. And he was an analogy to however big you could get or however small you could get. But I wanted to ask you this. when we think of the Bible and all sacred texts, really, we think about the trivium rather than the quadrivium, or at least I tend to do it as a reflex, right? We think about logic, grammar, rhetoric, those sorts of things. But you're talking about the quadrivium, which deals with things that can be measured: geometry, astronomy, music, and arithmetic. What do we learn by handling sacred text this way? Isn't that a rather unfamiliar approach to take to a sacred text? And what do you say to people who say, well, that's the Creator's direct communication with his creation? It's mind to mind. It's not something to measure and to observe. This is a different way of looking at sacred texts, isn't it?
Well, actually, I think the beauty of what's happening with this system is that it's actually a series of levels of information brought together. So I think you can view it, and I must admit I have a very specific, I would say to an extent, narrow view at which I'm approaching it, because I want to look into what is the testable, what is the measurable, but also where do we have clear documentation and where can we get exact measures to repeat this. So basically I've tried to be forensic as possible with the examination of what I've been looking for, and I can't avoid the fact that I'll bring in we have the 7 liberal arts, so I'll bring up some images there, and so that's one where we have grammar, dialect, logic and rhetoric, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. So these are some standard images of.
Where do those come from? Those pictures, like, are those look like those are ancient art, like someone actually had that inscribed somewhere.
Yeah, well, so the exact origin of the 7 liberal arts, officially speaking, will appear around about the 11th, 12th, 13th century, just at the same time that the great cathedrals started to be built in Europe. And what we had is Europe was coming out of the Dark Age that it had been in for a while. So just before the Renaissance, grand cathedrals such as Chartres Cathedral or Amiens and Beauvais, and those beautiful massive cathedrals, they just appeared out of nowhere in a sense, because it was what's special about those great cathedrals is that firstly, some of them were the first buildings taller than the Great Pyramid, and they were different. Previous to that, you had Roman architecture, which was very thick walls with very narrow doors and very few windows. So temples or cathedrals had been relatively dark, and then we had things like Chartres just appear out of nowhere, where they're rivaling the Great Pyramid in height, and they have very narrow walls with massive windows, and it was like a revolution in architecture. And so we had not only these large buildings, but they were hollow with very thin walls, and it was but this was the period where you could say that when most people think of masons, so what we had was a series of specialized stonemasons operating, building cathedrals around Europe, and they were a very select group, and every bishop who had money or king wanted to have a grand cathedral built in his city or his town, and so there was a competition to get this rare select group of not just stone workers, but also people who worked in metal, and glass makers and master weavers and master carpenters all had to come together to make these grand buildings. But this is the type of imagery, at least officially, that's where the 7 liberal arts comes from, and there are certain you'll find it on cathedrals, but this is like a classic example. There in the center we see the symbol. This is called the caduceus. Sometimes it'll be called the kundalini, but it's a rod connected with Hermes. It's 2 snakes about the rod. This will be another depiction of the 7 liberal arts. So they're practicing in geometry and music, but again, and at the center you'll see the caduceus. And this is actually, it's a complicated symbol, but the simplest way would be that it's the emblem of Mercury or Hermes. And so arithmetic, this is
Alan,
in Chartres. Yeah.
I'm sorry. So Alan, the competition between people who were building, let's say, cathedrals, these sacred structures, reminds us of the competition, let's say, in the 1920s or 1930s with skyscrapers, right? In other words, there's an art and science and everything that a culture had to offer had to be brought to bear to build its finest structures. And that's interesting. It's like everything came together in these structures. So I can't wait for you to talk about some of these numbers in the sacred text. How about you, Derek?
You already know that's bringing a pack to this fight here. I mean, this is going to get interesting, of course. Alan, if you're down, that'd be great, because generally speaking, it seems like what we've done already is laid a general basic foundation saying, look, this isn't everything from modern to ancient. As far back as we can find archaeological structures that are still standing and measurable, we see a theme, a common theme of what looks to be these liberal arts. And Alan's saying it's possible this stuff goes further back than when we can, tell. And there's these same numbers, same patterns in all these different sciences, if you will. And I think it'd be good. I think it'll be interesting to get into the numbers, because that's going to really turn everything on its head.
So Alan, let's get into some numbers for our listeners that many may be familiar with from the Bible. Now, we could take any sacred text, and some of these numbers appear not only in the Bible but in other sacred texts as well. And just have you talk about them. Let's identify 4 numbers. We could talk about 72, 144, 153, and 273. Those are numbers that you deal with extensively in your video series. So if we could do that, and I'd like to read a Bible passage where the numbers are found, just to kind of set things up, and then have you comment on what things you've discovered concerning that number. Would that be to your liking?
Yes, no problem. If you want to begin with 72, we could start off with. If you like to intro that. Yeah.
I think that'd be a great idea. Okay, let's start off with 72. And I think, Alan, you've provided us with a reference from the Bible on that. And I have it. It's Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. Okay? And keep in mind, we'll mention the number 72. Some manuscripts say 70. Others say 72. I think the 72 is more common with the Egyptian manuscripts, the Alexandrian, the Codex Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus. But it depends on which one you have, whether it'll say 70 or 72. But here, let's start with Luke chapter 10, verse 1. And it says, after this, the Lord, as Jesus, appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead of him, 2 by 2. Into every town and place where he himself was about to go. And he said to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I am sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. So there we have it.
Yeah, well, what I'd like to propose and give you examples is that we'll be using the Bible as a common theme, but I also like to examine how often it appears in apparently unconnected ancient cultures and still being practiced in varying forms now. But I'd like to sort of bring everything back to a bedding of geometry, music, arithmetic, and astronomy. So I'll always be bringing it back to especially the quadrivium. But before I begin there, we mentioned the trivium, but I think that the trivium and the quadrivium are separate, but they actually overlay one another. And one of the themes is that the discussion of geometry in weights and measures will often include a very strong moral element, and that we'll find in ancient texts, whether it's the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Bible, that the way one deals with weights and measures and keeping honest weights and measures isn't often used as a metaphor of living an honest and true life and having honest dealings with your neighbours. And in that sense, it also forms a basis of law. So whether it's the Magna Carta, the Code of Hammurabi, or these older codes of law, you'll often see that a major feature in there is in that the king must define what a accurate measure is. And then amongst those laws, I'll mention a certain compensation must be of a certain weight of grain or this much beer or similar themes. And so these ancient texts, that weights and measures is the basis of a working society, whether it's commerce at the marketplace, whether it's long-term trade, whether it's paying your taxation and the ability of a government to arrange itself and to measure land and take taxation. And this will also apply. Well, what we'll have is the same numbers that are so important in scriptures across the world will also relate to weights and measures. But if we begin with, sorry, not to rattle on, but these are just some examples of 72. Now, it's actually 720, but that's just a order of magnitude. So you'll find a certain group of numbers, and it'll always be, times 10, times 100, times 1,000. So it'll just be the matter of zeros added to this. But first, let's begin with a hexagon. And so as you can see, the inside angle of a hexagon is 120 degrees. All this will come back, but just as an example, because these themes of the hexagon, the pentagon, the vesica, these very essential geometric elements will relate back to systems of time, of measuring distance, and of course myth. So a hexagon, which like a beehive, these structures which you'll see repeated, that's 720 degrees. But another way to think about that is that the number of degrees inside a hexagon is equal to the number of minutes inside a 12-hour clock face. So we have a 24-hour day, but we have a 12-hour clock face, and so 12 hours times 60 minutes is 720 minutes would define day and night. This same number is in modern technology. For instance, screen resolution, you'll see 720p. In three-dimensional platonic solids, the tetrahedron is described by 720 degrees. This is the Washington. Sorry, I'll just skip past this one. So 72 degrees. We'll see this number. A pentagon or a pentagram is defined by 72 degrees. I'll show you more examples, but it also relates to 5, a golden number, the divine proportion in trigonometry. So we're seeing in relatively advanced geometry, but here's one of the most important ways to consider 72 is that a pentagram or a pentagon is broken up. So 360 degrees divided by 5 gives you 72. So by definition, that's one of the numbers connecting pentagrams. Now that's standard room temperature is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and ancient units of measure. So Romans, for instance, 1 sextula was 72 grains. This is just a random sampling of major cathedrals or major monuments, including the Arc de Triomphe, and especially places connected to memorials, monuments, cathedrals were built around this number of 72 feet. Is another example of it's used as a standard unit of measure. In the Kabbalist and the Hermetic traditions, you'll see which will extend back to even the Old Testament, but 72 names of God.
Hold on, Alan, hold on 1 second, brother. We're going to keep going on 72, but the picture that you had shown with all those buildings, I know that's probably just barely scratching the surface on the structures that you probably have with this number encoded into them. It seems that whether you call them the Freemasons, Hermetic structure, whatever, builders, okay, it seems that this was in their craft. This is their divine mathematics, if you will. And they're crafting it in their art. I mean, it's I guess you'd say in all these, and these aren't all, like, I'm looking at them right here, and I wish, if you're listening to this audibly, you have to take my word for it or check out the video once again on YouTube. He is showing unbelievable pictures of, like, multiple things. So I didn't want to stop you to, change topic, because I love this. It's just, I don't think our audience sees really what's going on here. Like the George Washington thing, I've seen a picture of that previously. Are those 72 little circles surrounding the circle in the middle?
Yes, and you'll also see now that image there. See it that there's Mercury with the caduceus. So and then you see Neptune with the trident. So you'll also see a connection of symbols there. So yeah, we have 72 stars around the central point, and that's another theme. We'll go into that, but the choice of God. So whether it's the agricultural gods or the god of weight and measure. Mercury, who's also the god of commerce and said to be a trickster god as well, and connected to science in general, and that's why that's a particularly important repeated theme, and to do with the history and the meaning of what these symbols are as well will be worth looking at. But what we have is that 72 reflects in legend, tradition, and but here's an example. Now I brought up before that. Okay, so this I showed this earlier, where 1 foot plus 1 Egyptian royal cubit plus 1 meter equals 6 foot, thus defining one of the concepts of an ideal design. And okay, now I think that's worth bringing up this. So now I'm going to have a look at Leonardo da Vinci and the famous Vitruvian Man. Let me find the... Okay, so that's an image that most people would have seen in some form or another, but this is by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's called Vitruvian Man, and it's named after the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who wrote this book. I think it's essential reading in this area. It's the 10 books of architecture, but what is in the actual text? So we'll also be connecting it to units of measure. But so just like with this image here, what we have is 1 foot plus 1 cubit plus 1 meter equals 6 foot. But also I have this image here, which has 1 meter long pendulum. Now I have to bring up the video, but if you hang a piece of string that's 1 meter long, you'll make a very accurate 1 second pendulum, in that the rope or the weight will swing back once every second. So, and it's now I'll bring those. But so what's happening is that the cubit, the foot, and the meter are relating to the relationship of man, but it's also pointing at this this pendulum information. So 1 meter, and the important thing about pendulums, and we can go into that more, but you need to swing it less than 30 degree arc. It would be a classic, the maximum amount of degrees that you want to swing it. So 15 degrees from resting, but that amount of arc is equal to 1 Egyptian royal cubit. So this is something I've done plenty of videos to go into in details of this, but what we have is connections between measures, making a harmonious series of measures, how they work well together, encoding deeper knowledge. So for instance, now if we can measure distance, and that being the meter, we can now measure time. And there's a lot more to it, but this is as one concept of multiple units of measurement coming together at very powerful and full of knowledge. And by that, so now I have Vitruvian Man. What I have down here is something called the Salamis stone. This is found in Greece, and it might be a bit hard to make out, but I'll be referring back to it. I'll be showing it clearer. But what it is essentially it's a conversion tool where we have different units of measurement embedded in this particular stone, which would allow the different masons from different parts of Greece to work together at the same, even though they were using different feet, they were working at the same scale. But this is embedded in Vitruvian Man, and so if we overlay that Salamis stone, it's, well, for instance, the stone goes to his umbilicus or his navel stone, being this is a theme as well we'll look into, but it overlays onto Vitruvian Man. And okay, now why the Salamis stone is important is because now I've marked it out. We'll see more again. It embeds 3 different units of measurement, which is the common foot, the ionic, and the Doric foot, as well as the samian on the outside. But for the moment, we just So what we have 500 BC, we have the allegedly modern English foot being used, and it's at the same time the Dorians, or the Doric region, was like a different state within Greece, and the Ionians were again a different state within Greece, and each had their own unit of measurement. But what we have on this stone is all these different units of measurement being displayed together, and that they actually come together to form a bed of knowledge. But okay, before I leave the Vitruvian, man, there's certain ratios built in. So that's at a 5 to...
So Alan, excuse me, before you go into those ratios built in, this thing that you said about the Salamis stone is fascinating. It reminds me, and probably our listeners too, of the Rosetta Stone. It's almost as if the Salamis stone does for the quadrivium what the Rosetta Stone did for the trivium, since the Rosetta Stone dealt with languages, cuneiform and hieroglyphics, and how do we recognize that? And it's one thing that enabled those languages to talk to each other. Isn't that the same type of thing going on with the Salamis stone?
Exactly enough, and we'll be applying that to the Parthenon. And I think this will be an important. It's an important structure for many ways, but for instance, the Parthenon will embed these numbers. But so the columns of a Parthenon are 48 feet high English feet, which is 45 Doric or 50 Ionic feet, as we saw on the Salamis stone. And this will be a theme that will go through all these ancient structures, that not only will they incorporate these sacred numbers through ancient units of measurement, they'll incorporate a series of these numbers through multiple units of ancient measurement. So we have almost, you could use the building itself as a conversion tool for the physical measures, but you can also use the building as a conversion tool between the different aspects of astronomy, music, arithmetic. So yeah, and it's always, everything will cross-pollinate, fertilize, complement, and lead to one another. And that's like part of it. Firstly, its brilliance in its simplicity, but the complexity of its depth is really quite amazing. And it's
wow.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the golden ratio. So if you haven't heard of that, or the number phi, in a measurable sense, one of the most beautiful things about the golden number is that, well, phi, we'll just round it off, equals 1.618, then 033. Okay, we'll just round it off to 1.618. So phi plus 1 equals 2.618, which is equal to phi squared. So if we square phi, it is equal to phi plus 1. Now if we divide 1 by phi, it's equal to phi minus 1. So phi plus 1, phi minus 1 is across dimensions, in this beautiful, it's the only number in math that has this particular property. And it's a very special number in nature, but whether it's in, we'll see. Okay, so you have Vitruvian man. He has, okay, so here would be some examples of a golden number. So whether it's seashells, the spirals that appear in sunflowers, tornadoes, hurricanes, we call them cyclones, the spirals in galaxies, or the spirals in these type of plants. These are just some examples of how the golden number, the golden ratio, which most people might recognize by the Fibonacci spiral, how this applies in nature, because that's what makes it such a beautiful, the properties in there lends itself to nature. It's a way to think about the golden number or the Fibonacci is a rate of expansion or growth, because it's just like in math or geometry, but it also applies in nature. And this will be, so whether it's ancient architecture, we'll see the same themes. And so this image by by Da Vinci, but it's based on the Marco Vitruvius work. Now, if the viewers can pause and read, I suppose, so I won't go into, but what we have, this is a chapter from book 3 of architecture by Vitruvius, and he talks about the proportions in temples, and basically discusses, for instance, the human body is so designed by nature that the face from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the head. So from your chin to your forehead, saying that that's a certain proportion of your body, but that's, I forget the exact name of it, but in ancient Hindu temples, Buddhist temples as well, that's a unit that they've found in places such as Borobudur in Indonesia, and they believe that the statue, so that's the man is defining a unit of measure. That's one of the common themes. And so in this particular part of the text, chapter 1, book 3 by Vitruvius, it talks about the different proportions of body to height and, you know, nose to chin, and saying that they have a breakdown of basic measure systems. Now, the inch would be one most people have heard of. It. A good way to define the inch is the width of your thumb, so which is also a bit like where the term rule of thumb comes from. You can use the width of your thumb as a ruler, as a basic gauge of an inch. And so these systems related to the proportions of an idealized body, which will apply to geometry, are the same aspects that will be repeated, for instance, artwork such as this, but it'll be also repeated in temples across time, across cultures, and they'll always come back to a certain set of numbers, and that number would be 72. So I think, okay, so I mentioned the number 72, the different aspects of it in weights and measure systems, both modern and new, whether it's screen resolution or ancient Roman weights, in religious texts, the Kabbalah, Hermetic traditions, but now we see it as astronomy as well. So measurements of the sun and the moon, and there'll be a small group of units of measure that I'll be referring to. So if I could set those up and just and really begin. So we'll come back to it, but so let's start. Ionic scale as in ionic columns, or it's also known as Ionian musical mode, which is which we saw in the Salamis stone. So for instance, that's one of the Ionic scale is one of the units measured found in that Salamis stone we talked about. And we also have the long scale, which is a Persian foot, but some would suggest that it goes back to the earlier stages of Stonehenge and other places. But what I'll refer to as the long foot is the Persian foot. You can see the ratio of conversion. But what we have is both in the Ionic and the long foot, we have the diameter of the sun beautifully harmonizing at these numbers based on 72. So both the sun and the moon create these, can be measured using 72 at different units of measurement. So it's not just one unit of measurement, it's multiple units of harmonize at that point. And also you might see that the diameter of a moon is 720 league. Well, that's like the 20,000 leagues under the sea. 1 league is 3 miles. So that's just simply 2,160 divided by 3, and that's how you get leagues. So what you have is sun and moon, but we also have it represented as a very important number in the Earth and in the stars, and by that I mean precession, which is a 26,000 year roughly cycle, but it works out that 1 degree of precession is equal to 72 years. So to observe this very important astronomical long count, this very long calendar, 1 degree would be about the minimum amount of time you'll be able to observe it. And it just happens to be also basically the average lifespan in many ways. So it's 1 lifetime is equal to 1 degree of precession, which is the minimal amount that you could make measurements of it in 1 generation. So there's a nice harmony there, and precession is about a relationship of the Earth to the stars and to the sun. So it's also where, not just in astronomy in general, but connections between many other aspects. But now in geometry, it's now, for instance, whether it's a pentagon, one of the important defining angles of a pentagram, is 72 degrees. If you draw a pentagon, the hard angle is 72 degrees. If you add up all the angles inside of a hexagon, is 720. In trigonometry, you see that 72 degrees is the golden number over 2. But also what we see there is the vesica. and the rhombus contained therein. But that is, so the vesica we see there, 120 degrees. That's the same from a hexagon. Sorry, from the vesica, hexagons will emerge. But again, we see this 120 degrees. So this would apply to a hexagon as well. But we have 360 degrees, and now we use decimal points. But traditionally, each degree was divided up into 60 minutes, and then each minute was divided up into 60 seconds, similar to the clock, which would make that angle equal to 7,200 minutes of the compass. So that's the compass. We measure angles. With a ruler we measure distance, and so these very common tools that we take for granted, whether it's the compass or the ruler, how it applies to navigation, but there's also a philosophical aspect. But with a ruler, we know how far we've gone. With a compass, we know in which direction we are going. If we have a clock or a pendulum, we know when we're going to get there. And these answer some of the big philosophical questions in life as well.
Hey, Alan, real quick, that Vesica Pisces, is that the net? Is that rhombus the net of the story with Jesus? Just kind of wondering, does the Vesica Pisces play a role in that story with the 153 fish? And I mean, we don't have to get into 153 yet. I'm just saying, this is...
Well, yes, and you'll see the net, or at least the almond shape, as it's called, the repeated theme in Christian art, like the oldest cathedrals as well, and some of the earliest Christian symbolism was the fish, and Vesica Pisces literally translates to the vessel of the fish, or the bladder of the fish.
Wow. This is getting good.
Okay, so I'll carry on with 72. Yeah. Okay. Now we'll see it in multiple. But here's, for instance, we see the Mayan calendar system, and part of my pronunciation, but the Atun is 7,200 days. So there's this Mayan calendar, and we'll see this calendar system repeated. We also have the yugas, the ancient Hindu traditions, which also have to do with cycles of time and the Great Flood. So we have 4 different yugas, but the Para Yuga is this, again, a number we'll come back to, but the yuga itself has an entry period, then the main body, and then you have an exit period. So you have a transition between each stage. And so the Para Yuga actually breaks down into 72,000 years, then 720,000 years, and then the exit of 72,000 years. So these are long count systems, both in ancient India, but also amongst the Mayans. So this is one example, and these will be repeated throughout this, how our number systems, our special symbolic sacred numbers, sacred structures, the number of beads we have on a japa mala necklace, for instance, are all part of a system now. It also will apply in different ways. So, for instance, at resting, the average human body should have 72 beats per minute, which is interesting because that is, we'll see this number emerging later, but 6/5 ratio, which is a hexagon and a pentagon, but we'll talk about this more, this 6/5 ratio. So 6/5 times 60 seconds is 72 minutes. So if some people maybe are familiar with some of these sacred geometry themes, so I might just drop in these ratios or some elements along the way, but just in case there is someone who's a little bit more into it. But this would also apply to, so it's about 72% of the body is made of water. So some of these will be coincidences. If you go out and measure everything in your neighborhood, you're going to find a collection of numbers, because everything can be expressed by number. There's an infinity of things out there. You could just go out and measure things at random, but I think that's also so things like this I mentioned out of curiosity, but there'll always be, we must account for the fact that there are so many things happening, and you can count everything. Eventually some numbers will start matching together. So I think that's an important theme with the look into numbers. But there are certain repeated areas and themes, whether it's geometry or astronomy, that at the very least make it a system for investigation. But now, for instance, another sense would be there were 72 books in the, by some count, the original or the older Catholic Bible. Now, Confucius, the famous philosopher of China, he had 72 disciples by some. Now, in ancient Egypt, Cyrus was murdered by his brother Set, and Set had 72 accomplices. Thoth, or the ancient Egyptian god of weights, measures, knowledge and science, this is an important character, he's Thoth. He won every 72nd day for the moon. There's a connection between him and the moon. So that's now, but also across the east. So you have this Sun Wukong, or a Journey to the East, Journey to the West. Sorry, this very famous piece of Chinese literature. You might know the show Monkey Magic, that old kung fu show with Pigsy and anyway Tripitaka. But that's so Monkey could do 72 transformations. Now he could also somersault 108,000 li in a single jump, and that's another, like 108 we'll see again. So Sun Wukong will be an example we're coming back to, but also in Shaolin there are a number of, between big and small Luhan, Quan style Shaolin, they also have the same numbers will be repeated, whether it's 36, 108, but here we see 72 postures, sort of being this number connected to Luke 10 with Jesus, again, by some definitions, there were 72 books in the Old Testament, the first, the Septuagint, sorry, I forget the exact pronunciation of it, but the first Old Testament published in the Library of Alexandria. But there were, it was either called the 70 or the 72, but we see like 72, just as, as Luther described before. Now, again, I think I've shown this in the Hermetic alchemist tradition, especially between the 14th and the 16th century, this very interesting period where we have the Rosicrucians and names like this starting to arise. But that, again, that this concept 72 with God, I've seen those now. Another example would be in the books of Solomon. So the Star of Solomon, sometimes depicted it with the five-pointed star. As we saw earlier, the angle defining at the heart of a five-pointed star is 72 degrees, and we have Solomon, depending on the book, capturing 72 genies or demons to help him in his work. And there we have also in like the songs there, I forget the exact, there's a lot of, from the books of Solomon and these books connected with him, emerged what's called Enochian magic, which was, again, later used by Aleister Crowley to write his books. Now, that all come off John Dee, but a lot of that, part of that, those type of works by those occultists at the time were based on biblical texts now. Okay, so while we've seen 72 as weights and measures, both ancient systems on TV resolution, it's also connected to different music, so Byzantine equal temperament is 72, but here's an interesting point in that room temperature, or 72 degrees Fahrenheit, is equal to 295.37 Kelvin. Now, I won't go into it now, but 29.53 days is the distance between a full moon. And so this won't sort of, as it emerges later, but now we've just begun with 72, so...
So you're telling me temperature, measurement, time, weight, sound, I mean, look, color, pixels on your screen. I mean, goodness gracious. And now we're about to get 72 virgins once we commit jihad. Come on now.
And, a few years ago they found the oldest surviving Quran, and it was, the actual term was 72 grapes would be received. But also a large section of the book was about architecture, because we see as soon as the Islamic period starts, they adopt Byzantine, Roman weights, measures and architecture, and we see the same temple measurements repeated and designed. So whether it's Christian architecture, Hindu, Islamic, Buddhist, and now even modern secular memorials and monuments will see the same numbers and proportions repeated. just with it's just like turning on its side and giving a slight variation, but there are certain core themes now. So with 72 as well, you have the tetragrammaton, which is like, again, another expression of 72 when it comes to, now even that symbol of a Vulcan sign, that's Shin, the fire, which is used in Masonic alchemy, for instance. The eagle's claw, they call it, that symbol. And it relates to Shin, or fire, which is a 21st letter. But so we see 72, but also 216 emerging from the tetragrammaton, which again is this constant theme. 72 degrees. Yes, okay, we've seen precession. Okay, so that's an intro to 72, and I'll bring up the harmonic numbers here. So these harmonic numbers are not the only way, but I think so. This chart of numbers I'll be referring to as the core of this particular system, and I'll beginning with so we'll begin with the concept of music, because Pythagorean tuning, as they call it, so that 432 versus 440 argument rests around this method. So this is Pythagorean tuning, what most people would say is the more holistic method. Where you have 432 and okay, so I'll bring back up the Vesica Pisces, and there we see it's a basic construction. It's one circle with the second circle having its center on the edge of the first. So you just draw two circles using, and what we have is basically we create a 2 to 3 ratio. So this now, before I go there, because I want to talk about the Vesica Pisces, but I think it's something worth highlighting and bringing up. So would it be? I might need a few moments just to find the right image. So if you and Luther could.
Absolutely. Luther.
Yeah. Alan brought up the Vulcan peace sign, and I happen to be wearing my Idic from Star Trek, so things are meshing so beautifully. I'm never going to look at my Vulcan necklace the same after talking with Alan. Well, I think it's just amazing.
Something that I got a joke for you guys. I thought it was funny when you mentioned the inch being the thumb. A guy at work, please cover your ears if you're not 18 or older. But anyway, he took his wife to Lowe's and decided he was going to get some lumber to help build the shed out back. And he asked his wife to go over there and grab the nails. He needed 6-inch nails. He's going to grab the wood, head off to the desk. And while they were in line, I just want to let you know, while they were in line, the register lady grabs the box, and out of nowhere, the guy freaks out on her and goes, "Honey, I told you to grab the 6-inch nails." And she goes, "I don't know. You tell me this is 6 inches." And they're 3-inch nails. Anyways, I figured I'd make it funny.
Okay, can the kids come back, Derek?
The kids can come back, guys. I've heard a couple things I wrote down. He brought up the Hindu the ages and the time for the Hindu writings, and so it was 864. I know that the Sumerian kings list has 432,000 years, and that is the 10 kings of the Sumerian list, which is half of the 864. Which these numbers all play together. I wrote down a few things that were in the Old Testament Exodus. Moses was in the wilderness, and 70 ancients were with him. They received the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. 2 of them, Mildad and Medad, were back at the camp. Then you had 72 descendants of Noah. And then you also had I'm just thinking of a few things off the cusp. There's 72 Buddhas on the temple in Indonesia, the statues of Buddha. And so it's like, oh, wow. I mean, there's a lot going on here. But anyway.
So,
Derek, I'm looking at the text itself, you guys. And in that passage in Luke, it talks about the harvest 3 times, right? He says the harvest is plentiful. And then he talks about the Lord of the harvest sending out laborers into his harvest. So harvest is obviously a very important word. And that phrase, his harvest, if you look at the gematria of it, the numerical value of the letters, I talk a lot about gematria, but it happens to be 72 times 23. So it's even embedded in that passage in Luke in some interesting ways.